This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Your Holiness, we've often been together with scientists discussing the relationship between the Buddhist perspective and secular ethics and scientific findings. Today we're going to be examining the spectrum that runs from complete self-absorption to empathy and compassion, particularly examining the question, is compassion a biological given? Are we born with some innate tendency toward compassion, or can it be cultivated, or both? And particularly today we're going to hear more about the cultivation, but as well we're going to look at compassion in the animal kingdom, what's biologically given. It was maybe 10 years ago, Your Holiness, at a conference on destructive emotions with the Mind and Life Institute that you said, actually I think to Richie Davidson here, that Buddhism has many methods for helping people manage destructive emotions very constructively, and you urged him to take these methods out of the religious context, study them very rigorously, and if it's found that they are of benefit to anyone, share them as widely as you can. Today's meeting, in a way, is the fruit of that comment, because you're now going to hear progress reports from research that were really launched with that very compassionate remark. We're going to first hear from Frans de Waal, who's an eminent scientist here at Emory, then from Richard Davidson, who you know well from the University of Wisconsin, Barbara Fredrickson, who you met at Wisconsin, who's from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then Philippe Golden from Stanford University, and our discussant is someone you know very well, Matthew Ricard. Let's begin. We have just a little time, and Your Holiness, for your information, the format will be a 10 or 15-minute presentation by the scientist, and then 10 minutes for discussion with you, and then at the end, if we have time, we'll have general discussion. So you may have heard that there are about 5,000 students here at Emory. You probably didn't know that there are also 1,000 or more monkeys here. Rhesus monkeys, chimpanzees. They're at the Yerkes Primate Center, which is where our first speaker, Frans de Waal, directs the Living Links Center. And his study of human nature, if you will, is based on looking at our cousins, the primates. Dr. de Waal is world famous for his studies of primates. His most recent book is called The Age of Empathy. He's looking at the roots of compassion in the animal kingdom. So without any further ado, please, Frans.
I'm very honored to be here, the first speaker. I'm very honored to be in your presence, to give an unusual lecture maybe, because it's on animals. And you may all have heard that nature is red in tooth and claw, and I won't deny that. That's largely true. But I will be talking about the other side of it. So I want to start with the beginning, which I think is synchronization and motor mimicry. If you talk with a sad person, you're going to adopt a sad body posture and a sad expression, and in the end you will feel sad, which is partly coming through your body. And if you talk with a happy person who's laughing, you will be laughing probably by the end. And all of this is synchronization, and all of this is sort of the early basis of empathy. And synchronization is a very old animal characteristic. So you can study it, for example, with yawn contagion. When someone yawns, you will yawn. And this is related to empathy. For example, autistic children, they yawn as much as other children, but they don't have yawn contagion. And this is one of the empathy deficits that we notice. We study it in chimpanzees. What you see here, above left, is a yawning animation that we make. And on the right hand, you see a real chimpanzee who's watching this on a screen. And he's starting to yawn. So yawn contagion is not limited to our species. It has been also found in dogs now recently. If owners yawn, you can try it at home. The dog yawns. This is a neonatal imitation in a rhesus monkey. This is a young rhesus monkey, maybe 2 weeks old. And the investigator is opening his mouth to the monkey. And the monkey starts to make chewing movements. And if the investigator sticks out his tongue, the monkey will start to lip smack and stick out its tongue. Now, for humans, we have known, for human babies, we've known for 25 years that they have yawn contagion and have this kind of facial imitation. But now it's being discovered for apes and for monkeys. Probably related to mirror neurons. This investigator is interested in mirror neurons. And don't forget, mirror neurons were discovered in this kind of monkeys, not in humans. And actually, we know more about mirror neurons in monkeys than in humans. These are two male chimpanzees who are together in a coalition, and they are highly synchronized, as you see, which is one way to communicate to the rest of the world that they are united, because they rule the group as a coalition. In chimpanzee politics, that's very common. And the most famous coalition on the international stage of the last 8 years, which by now you have all forgotten, but was there, was Blair and Bush. And if you look at Blair and Bush, each time Blair would go to Texas, he would walk like a cowboy. And the British media made fun of him because, of course, in London he would walk like an Englishman, which is very different. So whenever you walk with somebody, if it's somebody of the same age as you, you're going to fall into the same stride. We humans are actually very synchronized primates. You go to a pop concert or a sports event, we are extremely synchronized, much more actually than most of my primates. And so this relates, I think, to the human capacity of empathy. So now we get to the emotions. Of course, all of this is related to it, because I do think there is a basic body channel for empathy. The emotional contagion, this is actually a painting that shows emotional contagion between a girl and a dog, or between a dog and a girl. I don't know which direction this is going. But emotional contagion is found in all the mammals. And recently it was found in mice. So this is in a laboratory in Montreal, where they found that if you test, it's a pain laboratory, if you test mice out of the same box on a pain stimulus, the last mouse out of the box is more sensitive to pain than the first mouse out of the box. And they did not understand this. And they started testing it, and what they found is that when a mouse sees another mouse in pain, it needs to be seeing, it's not smelling or hearing, it becomes more sensitive to pain. And it needs to be a mouse that they know. If they see a stranger in pain, they're not affected by it. And this is general for all the empathy studies, also in humans, is that empathy is really an in-group phenomenon. It's a stretch to extend it to the out-group. It's an in-group phenomenon, and mice show this pain contagion. Now, I personally think that emotional contagion is as old as the mammals. It started with maternal care, because a female mammal needs to be sensitive to her offspring's pain, distress, being cold, being in danger, and a female who doesn't respond right away is going to lose her offspring. And so I think it's going to be general in all the mammals, and we should not be surprised to find it in mice. And we should also not be surprised that it's more developed in females than males for that reason, and that it's affected by oxytocin, which is by excellence a maternal hormone. And I think all these pieces fit together. So this is a dictionary definition of empathy: the ability to understand and share the feeling of another. And so you see the cognitive part and the emotion part. which have to work in tandem. Certainly in the human adult, that's what it does. And so you have what I would call a body channel of empathy, which is synchronization, motor mimicry, emotional contagion. And that's the channel you're going to find in a lot of animals. And then you have a cognitive channel, which relates to the self-other distinction, because now, if you want to take the perspective of somebody else, you need to draw a line between their feelings and your feelings. You need to draw a line between their situation and your situation. And so, strangely enough, being one with the other is important for empathy, but being separate from the other is also important for empathy. And this cognitive channel is probably not present in mice. I don't expect this in mice, but it's probably present in some other animals. So the self-other distinction allows an other orientation, such as showing sympathy for others or helping others. It correlates probably with recognizing yourself in the mirror, which is definitely true in child development. So at the age of 2, when the child starts to say I and look at me and things like that, and starts to recognize itself in the mirror, that's also the age at which they start to show more complex forms of empathy. And we think this may also be true in species evolution. This is not proven at this point, but that's a hypothesis. So, for example, chimpanzees, they recognize themselves in the mirror. And this is not true for monkeys. Chimpanzees are apes, and you are basically all apes. You may not look at yourself as apes, but in my view, as a primatologist, you have no tails and stuff like that. So you're basically apes, and you recognize yourself in the mirror. And so you have that capacity in common with the apes and not with the monkeys. We tested elephants on this. Elephants being known for empathy and altruism. And so the assumption was that they should recognize themselves in the mirror. We put a big cross on an elephant, a white cross, that they cannot see without a mirror. So there's no way for them to know it's there until you place them in front of a mirror. This elephant is in front of a mirror. She's slamming her trunk in the direction of the cross, and now you're going to see a very careful touching. There she goes, very careful touching of it. So this elephant, her name is Happy. The American media would say she's happy and she knows it. This elephant passed the mirror test, and this fits the idea that the species who have more complex forms of empathy are also the species who have a better self-other distinction. So elephants, they show targeted helping. And so they help each other up sometimes when they're shot down. So what you see here is very beautifully the two channels of empathy at work. You see the enormous emotional activation. These elephants have their ears out, their tails out, they're rumbling, they're very upset. So that's the emotional part. But they're also showing a smart response, which I call targeted helping. A response specifically geared to the situation of the other. They understand sort of the situation of the other, the baby elephant, and they help it out. And this targeted helping, which requires some perspective taking, is common in elephants and in dolphins and in chimpanzees and in humans, of course. It's not so common in many other animals. Many other animals will lick your face when you're upset, but that doesn't mean they understand your situation. So we look at sympathetic concern, as we call it, or consolation behavior in chimpanzees. These chimpanzees, by the way, they live at the Yerkes Field Station, which is just outside of the city. And consolation is a typical behavior of chimpanzees where one of them is distressed for whatever reason. Here you have a male chimpanzee, an adult male on the right, who is screaming because he lost a fight with another male. And a juvenile comes over and puts an arm around him. It's very typical chimp behavior, the reassurance behavior that they show. It's very similar to human consolation also. And so humans show the same sort of response. And we're very used to it. And in humans, in human children, you can use that response to test for empathy, for example. And I think this is a behavior that is absent in monkeys. It's present in chimpanzees and in other apes. And it relates to this other orientation that the apes can achieve. We did a study recently of 4,000 constellations. So that shows that it's a very common, it's not just a one-time story. This is a very predictable, common behavior. And we found, the overall finding was that females do more of it than males, as I would predict, which I also would predict for humans. And actually, Caroline Zahn-Waxler found that, that girls do this more than boys in young children, for example. But we also found an interesting finding. In addition, this is the graph, this is the very few data that I present. The females in the medium and low ranks, they do more than the males. But in the top rank, the males do a lot. And so the alpha male in a chimpanzee group has a very special role. He breaks up fights and he keeps order, and he has a lot of responsibilities. And one of them is to console distressed parties. And he does that very frequently, as you can see in this graph. So this kind of responses is not purely female. It's also present in the males under certain circumstances. So targeted helping, very common in the apes. The picture on the left is Binti Jua, who is very famous, a gorilla, who rescued a little boy. A boy had fallen into her enclosure at the Brookfield Zoo, and she went over. It's all on videotape, actually, and you can see it on YouTube, probably. She picked up the boy and consoled him, calmed him down, and brought him to a place where humans could attend to him. Nothing unusual. The only thing that's unusual is that it's a member of our species. But a gorilla female would do this any time for a member of her own species, a juvenile who falls out of a tree or something like that. So we do experiments sometimes on this kind of issues, and with the capuchin monkeys, which live on campus here, we do experiments to see if they want to work for somebody else. Do they want to do something for somebody else? And until recently, it was assumed that altruistic tendencies don't really occur in animals, truly altruistic tendencies. And now there are about 10 studies, certainly 8, but maybe 10, that are showing pro-social tendencies in other primates. The experiment that we do with the capuchins is a token exchange. They get a choice between 2 tokens. One is selfish, the other is pro-social. And we repeat this choice 30 times. So this monkey picks 1 token, and she needs to give it back. And when she gives it back, we put it in the middle so that they know what they picked. And then we feed both monkeys. So the one who does the picking of the token, the one on the left, is the chooser. The other one is only there to eat. So again, she picks the pro-social token, she gives it back. And we feed both monkeys. Now you will see what happens if she picks the selfish token. So this monkey does, by the beginning of the experiment, she knows nothing about the tokens. Now she picks the selfish. And she has to give that back. Sometimes they like the token better than... There they go. And now we feed only the monkey on the left. So think about this situation. The monkey on the left, it makes absolutely no difference what she takes. She gets rewarded, whatever she does. The only difference is that she discovers, hopefully, over the 30 trials, that sometimes the partner gets something, sometimes the partner gets nothing. And it depends on the token that she picks. And so then we see what the preference is of this monkey. Which token is she going to like better by the end of the experiment? This is the data. You expect, of course, 50% if they pick random. If you do it with non-kin pairs, look at the left, the complete left. If you do it with non-kin pairs, they go over 50%, meaning that they like, by the end of the test, they like the pro-social token more than the selfish token. If we repeat it with the same pairs, but with different colored tokens, just to see if we can get it again, they go again over 50%. If we do it with kin, they go even higher. So this is mother-daughter pairs and things like that. If we do it with strangers, if the partner is someone they don't know, they drop to 50%. Which brings me back to that mouse study, and I think many empathy studies in humans, is that empathy is really biased. Empathy is stronger for those who are close to you than those who are distant. And I think this is actually probably based on a sort of self-rewarding quality of that token, the pro-social token, is that these monkeys probably feel good doing something for somebody that they know, that there's some sort of self-reward built in. And nature often builds in self-reward for sex, for eating, for nursing. Nature has built in rewards for the things that we need to do. And I think being pro-social is something that animals in a group need to do. So finally, this is my last slide, I believe. I'm going to say something about how I see the connection with compassion and altruism. Empathy is automatically activated. I don't think you choose to be empathic. You are empathic and you react to things around you. And you react more if you pay more attention, and you pay more attention to those who are close to you. And so empathy is a biased phenomenon, but it's an automated phenomenon, an involuntary reaction actually. Now, you can get from empathy to compassion or to sympathy if you can take some distance. If you're not just overwhelmed by the emotions that are coming in, but you can sort of separate them out from the situation of the other and the situation of yourself. And that allows you to be compassionate. And then the question, so for example, you can see this. You can see it in the development of young children. A 1-year-old or 1.5-year-old child, if it sees another child cry, it starts crying and it runs to mom. It's not oriented to the other. It's overwhelmed by the emotion that it gets. And to get to sympathy and compassion, you need to be able to get over that. And as I said, children do that at the age of 2 approximately. And not all animals, I think, are capable of that necessarily. To get from compassion to helping behavior or altruistic behavior, I think there's a lot of factors that go into that. For example, if someone is drowning in a river and I cannot swim, I cannot dive in to help the person. So I need to make a cognitive evaluation if that's the right thing to do for me to help. And so there's all sorts of selfish factors that go into whether you want to help or not. And so whether compassion is translated into altruistic behavior has a lot of filters on it that relate to the circumstances and your abilities and skills and so on, and your relationship with the other. But animals, certainly, just like humans, very often make that decision to be altruistic. And I thank you.
We only have a little time for... Your Holiness, we have a little time for direct questions, if you have any, for Franz. And I know he has one for you.
아르센제 소소스 가서 우리 직실에 직 참스단담디 직시고로다. 근데 참지직 면자로야 데 고즈 레벨나야 개발티 두서서 심주셔야 그래.
In your presentation, Franz, you showed how it varies among different species, say between monkeys and the apes, in their capacity for taking this other orientation, and also empathy to some extent. So His Holiness is wondering, this is all kind of based on observational behavior, but His Holiness's question is, are there any work done that tries to look at the brain mechanisms that are different in these species in relation to your work and your observation?
I don't think
so this animal, for example, this animal more ability to react after suffering, ultimately because in their brain there is this something particular things there. The other who are sort of less sort of response because in their brain such things are lacking.
In other words, is there
so far, no.
any work done that will try to predict?
Well, let me give you one correlate that we have. We don't know how it works, but there's a scientist, John Allman, in California, who has been looking at von economy neurons, they're called, or what are they called? Spindle cells. They used to be called spindle cells. And at first he found them only in humans and not in other animals. And so he decided this is what makes us human. And if they deteriorate, for example, the sense of humor would disappear, empathy, and mere self-recognition would disappear also. Then he found them in apes. And he decided that it was a hominoid, you know, humans and ape thing. Apes have much less of them, but they have them. Then recently he found them with his assistant, Tia Hakim. He found them in 2 other species, dolphins and elephants. And those are exactly the species who recognize themselves in the mirror, the mammals, the dolphins, elephants, apes, and humans. So now we have this perfect correlate between these particular cells and mirror self-recognition. But we don't know what this means and what they do, because John Allman will say they add connectivity to the brain, but you know, all neurons add connectivity. I'm not sure what that exactly means. But there is this correlate in the mammals. There's also scientists, maybe you know more about this, like John de Cetty, who looks at the self-other distinction in the brain. I'm not doing any brain research, so I don't know much about that, but maybe you can say something about that.
There are some circuits that are important in self-other differentiation that do involve places, zones in the prefrontal cortex, which border on the area where John Allman has found the von Economo cells that you're describing, Franz. So it may be, but this is really an area that we just do not have the requisite scientific data at this point, but it may be that the von Economo cells, with their interaction with these nearby prefrontal circuits, play some role in self-other differentiation.
Yeah, I would also add that we usually draw a sharp line. We say you have animals who recognize themselves in the mirror and animals who don't. But I think that line will prove to be blurry. And so I would never say that, say, a dog has no self-awareness. Every animal must have some level of self-awareness. And it's just a matter of levels, and it's probably going to be gray areas. There's not going to be a sharp dividing line. But for the moment, we are focusing on, let's say, apes and elephants as being more empathic than other animals.
There is an area of the prefrontal cortex, I'm curious what Franz thinks of this, the frontal polar region, Brodmann's area 10, and recent evidence that has looked at this region across different species has found that this area is the largest in relation to any other prefrontal area in humans, and there's a graded increase in the size across different primate species. And there's been some suggestion that this is an area that may be very important for this kind of emotional behavior.
Thank you, Franz. I'm going to have to step into my moderator role as time police.
That's okay.
Ask Richie now to switch chairs.
Move. Yeah, I'm going to move.
And just to be sure the other panelists have time to make their presentations. And of course, Your Holiness, you know Richie Davidson very well. He's an old friend of yours. He's actually an older friend of mine. We were graduate students together at Harvard, which is, I think it's known here as the Emory of the North. Today, you've heard a series of findings from Richie. Today, he's going to talk about how the brain responds to the pain of another person and how contemplative practice alters that response, which is the basis of compassion. And I'm going to, Richie, ask you to try to hold everything to 20 minutes.
Certainly. Thank you, Your Holiness. It's wonderful to again be with you and always an inspiration. We're very grateful for your time. What I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about our work with compassion meditation specifically, and I'm going to address 3 questions. One is, what neural circuits are engaged by compassion training in expert practitioners? The second question is, does compassion training in novices, individuals who are just starting this kind of practice, engage the same or different circuits in the brain? And the third question is, what is the impact of compassion training on pro-social or altruistic behavior? So the first question, what circuits are recruited by the voluntary cultivation of compassion in experts? And I want to just very briefly review our key findings. This is in a study we did with 15 expert practitioners. And the area of the brain that you see circled there is an area called the anterior insula, which is an area that has a map of the visceral organs in the body. And the way we probe the compassion practice is we present sounds while the practitioner is meditating. And we have negative sounds that, for example, are sounds of a baby crying or a mother screaming. We have neutral sounds, and we also have positive sounds like laughter. And what is particularly interesting is that the expert practitioners show a big increase in the activity of this brain region, particularly in response to the sounds of human suffering. When those sounds are presented, there's a large increase in activation in that area, and the novices show very, very little change. And the figure in the upper right-hand corner simply indicates that when practitioners as well as novices rate the quality of their practice, for the experts it doesn't matter very much whether the quality is rated as not so good or very good, but for the novices there's a big difference, and when they rate their quality as good in terms of clarity, they show more activation in this brain area. There are two other important parts of the circuit that are changed in compassion meditation that we find, and one I'll come back to a little later, which is the one on the left, and that is the amygdala. And the amygdala is an area of the brain that is important in generating emotional responses. It's important in identifying salient, important information in our environment. And it also is important for detecting threat and suffering. And in that area of the brain, particularly in response to the negative sounds, the practitioners show a large increase in activation during compassion meditation. And the area on the right is an area called the temporoparietal junction. It's in the back of the head. And this is an area that has been very important in perspective taking another person's perspective. So this is all in the experts. And I'll come back to particularly the amygdala finding because that is different in the novices. And it is a question that I'd like to ask Your Holiness. But I'd like to turn now to the second part of the research on expert practitioners and just tell a little story. When I first met you, Your Holiness, in 1992, you asked if we would give a lecture to the young monks in the Namgyal Monastery, and we were with Francisco Varela at the time. And we placed an electrode cap with sensors on Francisco's head. And we had computers, and we were showing the young monks the brain recordings, and we thought rather than giving a dry scientific lecture, we'd actually give a demonstration. And we were placing the electrodes and standing in front of Francisco, and then when everything was all set up, we moved away so everyone can see the recordings, and all 200 monks just started laughing hysterically. And we thought they were laughing because Francisco looked funny with the electrode cap on. And what they're laughing about was that we were interested in studying compassion and placing electrodes on the head rather than on the heart. So it took us 20 years to get back to this. And actually Barb will talk about the heart as well. But what we find is that during compassion meditation, the experts actually show an increase in their heart rate. Their heart rate beats more quickly compared to novices. But what's most interesting is that when you look at the coupling, the connection between the brain and the heart, what we see in the red is the practitioners, that coupling is much stronger for the practitioners during compassion meditation. The CO stands for compassion meditation, and the N is during a neutral state. So only during compassion meditation is there a coupling, a connection between the heart and the brain in the expert practitioners. So this is something we think is potentially very important, and it indicates that the compassion practice is facilitating the communication between the heart and the mind.
What about blood pressure? Is there a corresponding increase?
There is a slight increase, but it's not, the heart rate increase is larger. And it comes back down just after the practice. So the next question, the last question that, the last set of questions I'll turn to is whether short-term compassion training could make a difference. And many people frequently ask me when I talk about our studies in long-term practitioners, they say, what about me? I will never be able to practice for that many hours. Can short-term practice make a difference? And so this is a study where we looked at just 2 weeks of practice. And we compared 2 weeks of 30 minutes a day with a comparison group that was taught cognitive reappraisal, which is derived from cognitive therapy. The elements of the compassion training that we used involved contemplating and visualizing the suffering and then the freedom from that suffering for different categories of people, beginning with a loved one, then moving on to themselves, to a stranger, to a difficult person, and to all beings. They often used a phrase, may you be free from suffering, may you experience joy and ease. And they were instructed to notice the visceral sensations, particularly in the area of the heart, as they were engaged in this practice. And they were instructed to feel the compassion emotionally and not to simply repeat the phrases cognitively. And then what we did is we did brain scans before and after the 2 weeks of training. And then at the end, we gave the participants tasks to measure their altruistic behavior. And so to measure the altruistic behavior, we use tasks that are similar to what Ernst Fehr uses, the economic decision-making tasks. And in this particular task, a person can donate a certain amount of money to the recipient. And if the donation, if the amount they give is very unfair, what we call the third party can use some of his money to actually take away money from the dictator and give it to the recipient, to make it a more altruistic transaction. And in this case, they're using real money that we give them, and the amount of money they're left with is how much they actually will be paid. 2 weeks of compassion training makes people behave more altruistically. So on this hard-nosed measure of economic decision-making, we actually find that just 2 weeks of practice compared to cognitive reappraisal has people behaving more altruistically. Now, one of the fascinating things, and this is where the findings from the novice practitioners differ from the expert practitioners, is that among the novice practitioners here, after the 2 weeks of training, the more the activity in the brain area called the amygdala, the more that activity goes down, the more altruistic the participants behave. Among the expert practitioners, it was increased activity in the amygdala that was found during compassion meditation. Here, it's more decreased activity in this area is associated with more altruistic behavior, and I'll come back to that at the very end. We also find that the same area of the brain that I showed you with the expert practitioners, Your Holiness, the insula, that area of the brain also changes in response to compassion training, and that change is highly associated with how much altruistic behavior they display at the end of the 2 weeks of training. The more altruistic behavior they exhibit, the more change in the connectivity, the connection between the insula and an area of the prefrontal cortex. Now I'm just going to skip to the end here. This is the last data slide. What this simply shows is that when you put all of these brain regions together, it predicts a lot of the behavior on the altruistic decision-making task. So the amount of change that we see in these practitioners, specifically in response to compassion training, is very highly associated with how altruistic they are when they perform this task at the end. So to summarize, there are dramatic differences between long-term practitioners and novices in their neural response to suffering during compassion meditation. The experts appear able to express high levels of activation in the amygdala, while the novice practitioners show reductions in the amygdala. And the amygdala has often been associated with distress. And it's as if the expert practitioners can endure that suffering and at the same time exhibit compassion and behave altruistically. Whereas for the novices, they seem to need to reduce the activity in this region in order for them to behave in a more altruistic way. So this is the last slide, just to also complete the summary. Among the novice practitioners, remarkably, just 2 weeks of training for 30 minutes a day can produce a measurable change in the brain and an increase in altruistic behavior. And we find that the circuits engaged by compassion training partially overlap with those that are found during empathy, but seem to also involve parts of the brain that may be important for action and for translating aspiration into actual behavior. And so that's an area that is a little different from what's found in empathy per se, and may be part of the distinction between empathy and compassion, where compassion may involve activation of circuits that are involved in the actual action, translating aspiration into action, whereas empathy may be more in the realm of pure emotion. So thank you so much, Your Holiness.
Richie, 5 minutes. Just a short time. Richie, a wonderful presentation. Because of our time problem, you have about 5 minutes for a discussion. I don't know, Your Holiness, if you have a question for Richie. I know he has one for you.
So far, any sort of test or test, the person, perhaps novice maybe, some meditate or thinking compassion towards a person who usually, you see, the person feels irritation, negative. But during that meditation, deliberately try to create compassionate feeling towards that person. And then another, you see, the relative, close friend, develop some kind of compassion. So whether there is so far any sort of
study done on comparing these two types of...
It's a wonderful question.
Here you say the reason, as you know, the usual sort of compassion towards one's own close friend, the attachment, very much sort of mixed there.
Yes.
The other one, the pure compassion without attachment.
Yes. Yes. One of the things, Your Holiness, is that in these altruistic tasks, it involves being altruistic to a stranger. So someone that the participants don't know, it's not a loved one, it's someone who is a complete stranger. We are now testing whether the same amount of altruistic behavior is expressed toward the different categories of people, someone they know, a stranger, and a difficult person.
Yes.
And so I think that's what you're asking. And
I think His Holiness was asking
the changes in the brain.
yeah, a bit more basic question. Has any study been done on trying to look at the brain expressions of two instances of meditation? In one context, the person is meditating, generating compassion towards a difficult person. In another instance, he or she is generating compassion to a loved one.
Yeah. Well, we have done that with some long-term practitioners. And in the long-term practitioners, we have not seen any systematic difference. I think that in the more novice practitioners we would, although we have not done that yet in the more novice practitioners. But in the long-term practitioners, there is no systematic difference between meditating on a loved one and meditating on a difficult person. But I think this is something that may change with training.
I think our time is up. We can continue if there's time for discussion later. I'm going to ask Richie to change places with Barbara Fredrickson, who, Your Holiness, thank you, Richie. You met Barbara Fredrickson at the opening of Richie's Center at the University of Wisconsin, and you may remember that she's the director of the Laboratory for Positive Emotions and Psychophysiology. She studies positive emotions, that's her area of expertise. Her book is called, oddly enough, Positivity. Where she got the title, I have no idea. But Barbara's the Keenan Distinguished Professor of Psychology at the University of North Carolina, and is going to talk about what happens in our brain and body during positivity and how that relates to caring behavior.
Your Holiness, it's a great honor to have your presence and participation here today. Thank you. And I want to thank my hosts at Emory for inviting me to be part of this symposium. You may remember that the theoretical framework from which I work comes out of evolutionary psychology, and I call it the broaden and build theory of positive emotions, and it has two proposals in it. That the first is a momentary effect of positive emotion states like love, gratitude, joy, connections to compassion here. In the moment, these emotions expand or broaden people's awareness, allowing them to see the big picture and see interconnection with others. The second proposal of the theory is that over time, these moments of broadened awareness add up and build enduring resources of the person, useful traits like mindfulness, social connections, physical health. And it's in testing this second aspect of the theory that got me involved in testing the effects of meditation. So I became very interested in loving kindness meditation when I first learned of it, because I was interested in testing what would happen as people, in a way, increased their daily diet of positive emotions of love and concern and compassion, and how would that change people. And so we've undertaken a number of randomized controlled trials in workplace settings with novice practitioners, people interested in learning to meditate, to reduce stress, which is often how it might be presented in a workplace context. And then we did intensive assessments of our participants at the start of the study, again 3 months later, and then every day, virtually every day in between, they answered a few short questions about how much they meditated that day and what their emotions were. And our first randomized controlled trial on this was published in 2008 in a paper that we titled "Open Hearts Build Lives," to be able to convey how people were changed with this practice. Our second project is currently in preparation. We're looking more at the physical heart. Your Holiness, you may recall this, that my research more recently has been focused on the vagus nerve, which is one of the cranial nerves that emerges from deep within our brainstem and connects our brains to our hearts, among other, it makes other stops along the way. And the vagus nerve is especially responsible for slowing our hearts, keeping our sort of naturally high human heart rates down-regulated. The fight or flight response is what would kick our heart rate and blood pressure into high gear. The vagus nerve has been more connected with a calm and connect response, a soothing response on the heart. And the conditioning or the strength of this vagus nerve can be measured in terms of what's called vagal tone. Like muscle tone, higher vagal tone is better, and it is represented by a very subtle arrhythmia in heart rate, such that our heart rates slow down a bit when we exhale and speed up a bit when we inhale. It's this entrainment between breathing and heart rate. And higher levels of this vagal tone have been connected to better regulation of bodily symptoms. In particular, there's better glucose metabolism when people have higher vagal tone, better regulation of inflammation. And so vagal tone, high vagal tone, has been linked to better health in terms of lower incidence of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. At a psychological level, higher vagal tone has been linked to the better ability to regulate our attention, better ability to regulate our emotions, and better ability to regulate our social behavior, too. And so in both the physical health and psychological health domains, there are strong connections between this aspect of the vagus nerve. When I tell people about vagal tone, people are often interested in whether they have high vagal tone, because there's all these good aspects related to it. And the very hopeful discovery we've made is that it doesn't matter if you start out with high or low vagal tone. With loving kindness meditation, people can raise and improve their vagal tone, just like we can improve muscle tone with physical training. We can improve vagal tone with emotional training. And I didn't say much about our loving kindness meditation, but it was very similar to the compassion meditation that Richie described in terms of its focus on the self, close others, and extending to all humans. So with just 6 weeks of training in novices, we see changes in resting vagal tone. This is not measured while people are meditating. So it was a shift in their vagal tone in their habitual state of rest. Now, this is a new take on our data that's different than I was able to present to you in May. Well, another thing we found more generally in our studies is that there's a reciprocal relationship between between vagal tone and increases in people's warm and loving connections with others in daily life. We find that people who started our study with higher levels of vagal tone showed more dramatic increases in their reports of warm and loving connections with others in daily life. That's represented by the arrow on the left, that this cardiovascular measure predicted feelings of love and and closeness in daily life. But we also found the reciprocal relationship, that people who showed greater increases in warm, open, loving connections with people in daily life showed the biggest changes in vagal tone over time. So there's a cycle here. There's a phrase used in psychology a lot, a vicious cycle or a downward spiral. Here we have an upward spiral or a virtuous cycle where changes in our physical hearts are supporting changes in our social and emotional connections with others in daily life. This is just a quick slide to show that from this and related work, what we conclude is that positive emotions, these warm and compassionate feelings we have towards others, seem to be the active ingredient within the effectiveness of loving kindness meditation, that they build cardiovascular resources, energize these upward spirals, and provide support for the broaden and build theory. The one thing that I'd like to point to is the directions that I'd like to go in and pose a question to you, Your Holiness, is that it seems clear that momentary states of love and compassion can echo powerfully through communities and whole cultures and in their outward expression. But what we're seeing here is that the inward expression of love and compassion echo powerfully through people's minds and bodies. I feel like the picture that's emerging from the science here is that in a way, our bodies were designed for love, in that the more we love, the healthier we become, the more flourishing at a physical level. And I'm wondering if I sense that's also true at a spiritual level and in terms of people's wisdom. And my question for you, Your Holiness, is from a Buddhist psychology perspective, how do these small moments of love and compassion, that's warm and open heart, add up? How are they viewed as adding up over time to create wisdom, to create spiritual advancement? How is that understood in Buddhist psychology, the pathway from love and compassion to wisdom?
My belief, the compassion brings inner strength that creates more calm mind, less fear, less anxiety. So that provides the proper utilization of our intelligence.
It provides a kind of a space.
Through that way, some connection. So
that's the way His Holiness says how, experiences like compassion and loving kindness are connected to wisdom. But otherwise, it's very difficult to say that there is a direct causal connection. It's by creating this space. There is, however, the arrow of relationships seems to go from the other side. As a result of greater awakening and intelligence and understanding, that can have a direct impact upon one's compassion. So in fact, the situation is more complex than it seems, because compassion is understood to be kind of mental processes that operate primarily in the modality of kind of an aspiration, whereas wisdom and more cognitive, mental processes engage through a different route. So the relationship is more complex.
I would suspect it would be more complex. Yes, that's... Yeah.
Thank you very much, Barbara Fredrickson.
Thank you.
Your Holiness, you, I know, are familiar with Philippe Golden, our next presenter. He spent 3 years living right across the street from you at Namgyal Monastery in Dharamshala, Cloudgunge, and is presently a research scientist at Stanford University in the Compassion Project there. And I also know that he presented some findings to you just a few days ago at Stanford, but today he promises to have some new results to discuss with you. I should also add for the students in the audience that Philippe is an interesting model. He spent his entire junior and senior years in Kathmandu and somehow got credit for it. So you can ask him later.
You can do it. So again, thank you for giving us your precious time and mind. So this work is really inspired very much by Your Holiness and also by your wonderful translator, Geshe Thupten Jimpala, who, working together with a whole team of people at Stanford, has really helped us, inspired us to do this research. So we have great respect. But essentially, this is an 8-week program that's designed around several modules, beginning with stabilizing the mind through specific practices to mindfulness and others to stabilize the mind, to make it ripe, ready to do different compassion and loving kindness practices towards, like as Richie said, towards people who you love, towards yourself, towards people who are difficult, strangers, and then expanding to global. And then another component is really understanding the interdependence between self and other and common humanity. And then finally, this is all preparation for the more active form of compassion, which is really giving and taking on the suffering of others and recognizing it. So this is an 8-week program, and we are doing a lot to try to really understand how it works and how it helps. Very simply, the idea is, how does this compassion cultivation training influence for today just social approach behaviors or intention towards others, and also emotion? 32 healthy adults thus far, and these are adults roughly 39, 40 years old. I'm not going to show you a video, but essentially this is one task that we did before and after, where we show 4 different people describing their own emotional pain, autobiographical, and you watch this. And
for the audience, can you give an example?
Yes. So, for example, a man who goes on a business trip, he knows his father is dying. Before he can reach his father and get home, the father has passed away, and the man feels tremendous guilt and shame, deep, deep emotional pain. Another example, a woman who's an athlete, who was swimming and she almost drowned, and she came out of the water and she was in deep, deep pain, and the boyfriend took a photograph of her in that moment, and she felt completely vulnerable, ashamed, sad. So we show several of these clips of real life situations. And we ask many things, but here, just to show from the before, after 8 weeks of training, how much do you feel a sense of caring for this person? Social orientation towards another person. That increased. Caring for another person. How willing are you to help this person? And that also increased. And again, this is self-report. And then how much time would you be willing, your own time, to actually sit and talk to this person who you see is suffering? And that also increased. So these are some indicators of a shift in how we orient or would approach another person. In terms of emotional responses, and the idea here is that maybe small shifts in emotion might support these changes in behavior. Changing the meaning of some emotion, perhaps the negative emotion when I see someone suffering, through thinking. We call this cognitive reappraisal. We actually saw that specific use of thinking, logic, reasoning increases. And importantly, when you're with, reporting less anxiety when you're with people who are suffering. So this might go back to some emotional contagion and that Dr. Franz de Waal mentioned, the ability to feel less anxious broadens the view and allows us to use more of our perspective taking. And then this is what I want to emphasize for now, which is suppression, and I'm going to ask you about this. So there's this notion that sometimes we suppress showing what we're feeling inside. We don't show it on our face, we don't speak about it, we maybe don't even show it in our body. So the compassion meditation training, what we saw is that people use this suppression less after the meditation training. This is important because of the following. We found that people who said that they used more suppression, they suppressed showing their emotion, lots of negative things. They were less able to recognize emotions in other people and also in themselves. They were less able to feel the distress in other people who are suffering and also in themselves, emotionally. And also, going back to this video task, they had less sense of caring for others, less willingness to help others, and less giving of their own time to others. So one thing I definitely want to ask is, perhaps in the Buddhist text, this notion that, is there an idea that with compassion meditation training, our practitioners more and more spontaneously open, expressive, free to show their emotions? Because here in the West, we have many situations where we often push our emotions down. And at least the data here is saying that's really a problem, and it can also shift with compassion practice. So simply, so far, this compassion cultivation training might help increase the sense of care for others, the wish to help, and actually giving your time to others, and reducing the social anxiety and increasing this emotion regulation. And funding from Sea Care, Project Compassion at Stanford and Fetzer, and a beautiful picture by Mathieu Ricard. And that's it. So the question I have, there are many, but this notion that many of us walk around suppressing. We don't show, we don't speak, we don't show in our body. And at least the data suggests that this really is problematic. And I don't know if in the Buddhist text there's specific discussion of how compassion meditation changes people's willingness to open. And I think showing emotion, not just positive or negative, but all flavors of emotion, showing all of it, instead of...
The suppression is clearly must be understood as part of a kind of a mechanism that we all have, and which may be rooted in a wish to try to project a better self-image, and then underlying that is a cherishing of one's own self, and part of that mechanism might involve suppressing things that you don't want others to see.
So self-centered, self-centered, equal. So the compassion, sense of caring of others, is direct opposite. So then, you see, there's one way, self-centered attitude reduce, and then also another aspect, why you sort of hide your weakness. You feel other, if they know your weakness, then they may, because of that, as a different impression. So there is some kind of element, little distrust.
Distrust of others.
Compassion reduces that. So what those do?
So this is how you can see the connections. Compassion reduces the distrust in others. So there's less need for suppression and hiding things of yourself. That's great.
The natural law, natural law.
This is all part of the natural law, cause and effect.
Interdependence of something. Interdependence of
Now,
something.
you actually mentioned the word interdependence, so this is an example of one of them.
Of course, external matters also is very much interdependent. Then our emotion, particularly, much so interconnected.
Interconnected.
Well, we're going right into our discussion period. So, Philippe, please join in. And Richie, do you have observations?
I actually wanted to ask a question that involved Franz and also get your comments, Your Holiness. One of the things that we see in our studies with human beings is a lot of variation when a person begins in their propensity to behave altruistically or to behave compassionately. And one question for you, Franz, is to what extent is that variation present in the animal kingdom, particularly in the primates that you've been studying? And the related question is, are there experiences in the animal's past which may be associated with individual animals who may be more compassionate than others? And are those similar to some of the intuitions that I know Your Holiness has had about the importance of the mother-infant relationship as the seed of compassion? And is there, what can we say about that in the animal kingdom?
Well, certainly all animals are different. They have personalities. And so, for example, in the yawn study, I remember seeing a graph where some chimps don't yawn at all when they see a yawn, and others, they go crazy yawning. And this is true for humans also. And so there is this enormous variability. With all the talk about training, I've been thinking, how could I possibly train an animal to be compassionate? And I'm not sure that that's going to be possible. But learning from others is probably an important part. And you mentioned the mother-offspring context. I imagine, but no one has ever done the experiments, but I imagine that if you are a child of a mother chimpanzee who shares her food freely, compared to, and we have those too, females who hog all the food and no one can touch it, that must make a difference in how that child later is going to respond itself. Now, no one has done that kind of experiments, but those things are doable. I think they should be done, probably.
The chimpanzees are usually charging in and the devil is all the maliki pushed out. This is a social animals are that's social animal, there are some don't have chick petty catchment. Maliki of chick. That man then give a meeting in the middle of it. Turtle search, TV, container.
So this is related to your question about the nature of contagion and the degree to which animals respond, and also the basic kind of resonance, ability to resonate, not at the cognitive level, but at the basic emotional level. His Holiness was saying that in the case of the chimpanzees, or the apes that you have shown, they're all like us, kind of they're part of the social animal world. So the mother-child relationship is very important.
No, two things. Social animal category belongs to the
social animal.
Then second, their survival depend on
entirely on
mother's care.
So these are two facts that we share with these apes. And His Holiness is wondering...
So usually I feel that some turtles, the mother lay down the egg, then egg hatch. Then the young turtle, the survival by themselves. For their survival, for their proper growth, not depend on mother's care. So I sort of wondering, and their own mother, if we put together, I don't think that both sides some kind of affection each other. I don't think, because nature is such, no need others sort of care. So therefore, no sort of source of caring other.
No
that
bond.
means the emotional level is affection, except it's sex. Otherwise, is it no because of that.
No element that would create a bond.
Well, maternal care is obligatory in the mammals. So all mammals have it. Whether you're a loner, like a tiger, you have to have maternal care. Or whether you're social, like a baboon or a chimpanzee, you have to have maternal care. So that's a given for all mammals. And it affects the way they are. So for example, one of the earliest ideas about the limbic system by Paul MacLean was about the separation call. Mammals have a separation call. If the young are left alone, they're going to call. And not all animals do that. Lizards don't do it, or frogs. I mean, this is a mammalian thing. And so they call for help. And the mother is supposed to provide the help. And so this is a universal mammalian characteristic, and that's why I think some form of empathy is going to be found in all the mammals.
I mean, beautiful. The turtle.
What about
Mammal.
turtles?
Turtle.
Yes, mammal.
Well, that's interesting. There's some reptiles, like crocodiles, who have some parental
But
care.
crocodile, I noticed, you see, the mother crocodile
Takes,
remain from distance, is watching whether you see their children facing some danger or not. So if there is some danger comes, then mother thrashes.
yeah?
But turtle not there.
No. So crocodiles have some maternal care. And so they take the young in their big mouths and they walk around with them. So it's interesting because birds, now there's some recent findings on empathy responses in birds. And there's for example, one study on geese where they found, talking about the heart, they measured the heart rate. When a goose sees its mate in trouble, in fight with somebody else, the heart starts to flutter. And so birds have some of it, which means that the ancestor of the birds and the mammals was a reptile. And dinosaurs have parental care. There's a lot of speculation about that. So personally, I think the root of these empathy responses probably goes back a little bit further than the mammals and goes to their reptilian ancestors.
So the subjective
Holiness is wondering, those animals for whom in the early stage their survival is not dependent upon the mother's presence or mother's care, whether you would see these kind of rudimentary forms of empathy.
And the butterfly also. No connection.
You mean whether you see that in reptiles, for example?
Like lizards or butterflies, for example.
Butterfly.
So it's a mother.
They live one day, they don't have time for that.
They but mother, some kind of sort of sense of concern about their sort of youngster. They, like mother turtle, also you see they choose the right place.
To lay the eggs.
Where you see when their children, you see, because of that, they come up, you see they can reach seawater a little bit close.
Yeah.
And also, I think, as a sort of protection from heat and some other quite deep.
Yeah.
The nest is ready. And then you see the sand cover. So mother have some kind of sense of concern because of the survival of their children. But they never meet.
We biologists would probably say she has been programmed to put the eggs in a particular spot.
But whether you accept the mind or not, you see, these animals, they are very movement. You see, there must be some element beside the brain. Isn't it? Once with Varela, you see the definition, sentient being or non-sentient, the thing which can move by itself, from some sort of distance, that there is some connective. With that, they can move certain direction like that. Although the movement, the flower also had some movement, but no kasota ability to from here, some other place, right? So anyway, okay, different field.
We have a few more minutes remaining. I neglected, and I apologize, to introduce at the beginning our discussant, Matthew Ricard,
Yes.
whom of course you know well, but for the audience, I'd like to point out that Matthew is a very unique individual because he got his PhD in biology at one of the Sterling Institutes in France, and then during his postdoc period decided to become a monk and has been ever since. So he is the first in the lineage of monk PhDs that I think the Tibet Emory Project is going to
And French.
see more. And he's also French, yes.
Oh.
So, Your Holiness, I think Matthew has a question for you.
But you know, a lot of what we said as try some kind of connection between compassion and fearlessness. If you feel very insecure, naturally tendency is to protect yourself, and you feel the threat, and also any extra suffering from outside is perceived as an additional threat that can cause distress and withdrawing. Now, if someone is not insecure for himself or herself, then naturally there's a readiness to engage in others, and the more they will see the suffering, the more their courage, determination to do something will do. So this is in connection with a few of the things that has been said. For instance, the amygdala is known to be related to fear. So it is possible that in the novices, that when they are meditate with compassion for 2 weeks, there's a reducing amygdala that may feel that they feel more safe, and so therefore they feel less risky emotionally to engage with others. Now the practitioner, maybe they have more confidence that they can absorb a great amount of the other's feeling and yet not be unsettled, and therefore they don't need to protect themselves. So you can see what would seem to be more fear, but in fact is the capacity to buffer all that. And it's also related possibly to what you said about hiding emotions. So it could be that repression is not simply that you are not attuned to others, you lack empathy, so basically you are indifferent. You don't recognize your emotion, you don't recognize in others, so you don't react, you are not interested. Then the other step, you repress them because you are worried of the trouble that might create. And then when you sort of loosen that, then you start expressing your emotion, but there might be even a further step, where there's kind of deep stability and cognitive compassion, very vast compassion, that you may not need to, you don't suppress them, at the same time you don't react very visibly. So this is all range of various aspects of going from insecurity to fearlessness, and then from being self-absorbed to unconditional compassion. So since I know that Your Holiness has been often speaking about the relation between compassion and courage and fearlessness, I would request if you could share a few thoughts with us on that.
Compassion is a caring of others' difficulties. So that comes from voluntary basis. So for that, firstly, you have full confidence, willpower. So there is strength. Encouragement.
So that's a form of courage.
That 닝질이야, that 되었다. 겸득이 닝질. 또 우리 자나서 닝질.
So when we speak of compassion, we need to understand that there are different degrees, for example, or kinds. Some kind of compassion, some form of compassion may take the form where compassion remains only at the level of wish to see the other person be free of suffering. But then you can have a more kind of strong...
I think that level 대한 모tor을 좀 고도 유효요.
So one would predict that at that level of experience, the kind of the motor regions of the brain may be less active. But then you have other forms of compassion where, in addition to this wish to see the other person be free from suffering, there's even a willingness to do something about it, kind of reaching out. So in that, so that's it's known as the compassion in the form of wanting to help or wanting to save.
So that compassion, you already see the possibility of the end of the suffering. Then more willing to
reach out loud, to help. So here, of course, if you are able to see there is a solution to the problem of that person, then the willingness will be even greater. And here, of course, the role of understanding and intelligence becomes important.
So, because again, because Geshwan, debut to Melamini, tell a missive logic, debut to Megi, Gu, Janet Tommy, to men Jungul Samyata, sometime. Or the Nigatonia is German.
So, we had this. I made this remark the other day at Stanford. We also need to take into account different forms of compassion. Some forms of compassion may be directed to a very immediate, evident pain in front of you, which is in fact a resultant state. And some compassion may even be directed not so much to the evident pain in front of you, but rather to causal conditions that will lead to future suffering. So in here, your compassion for that other person is really to help that person avoid future pain, potential suffering. So and it's more directed on the understanding of the causal conditions that lead to suffering. So there's a difference here.
자상한 소수를 한다 가사대 지기부 되게 한다. 인들라 장사. 레벨은 지기부 소수. 띠 잡아면 성기. 어디? 대패지 잡아 있으면 그때.
So these are of course matters for research and study. For example, His Holiness was saying that he would predict that in these two forms of compassion there would be some differences in the activation, at least in the amygdala and the other insular
so your responsibility to carry further investigation.
Okay, Richie, you know what to do. And Your Holiness, thank you so much for giving us your time and your generosity with your wisdom. And panelists, thank you for joining us. And all of you, have a good lunch.